So our next presentation is from Dr. Hugh Hanmer, the right way around. He's a Senior Research Ecologist for the British Trust for Ornithology, the BTO. He has particular interest in the impacts of human interactions around garden bird supplementary feeding. And he is our next speaker. So I'll hand over to you, Hugh.
Okay, right. Thanks for having me. Right, so I'm going to talk about garden bird feeding and the fact that it's more complicated than we might think on the face of it. But first off, I want to give you a quick background on the BTO, since we sometimes get overlooked. We are a research-focused organisation focused on birds, looking to harness the potential of bird watching to inform conservation. We've been around since the 1930s. And one of our main things, we will use science, communications, engagement, bird science people to help try and find solutions for the biodiversity crisis. While our stock in trade tends to be citizen science surveys. And indeed, there's potentially running to the millions of hours per year. And given we have a staff size of about 150, which has grown in recent years, is far more than we can manage by ourselves. In a garden context, we run or involved with several surveys that are particularly relevant. Right, so to understanding garden birds, firstly, and perhaps probably the largest thing is we have the Garden Bird Watch. This is a weekly survey, similar to a bit like the RSPB Garden Bird Watch, but it's year round and it's very much aimed to understand how, when and why birds and other animals use our gardens. It's been around since the mid-90s, and we have about an average about 6,000 people taking part each week, but many more people signed up and are taking part at least occasionally. And so if you're interested in finding out more, please do check out our website. So kind of more a smaller survey, but even longer running, we have our garden bird feeding survey. This is a winter survey that's been running since the early 70s and very much focused on specifically on bird feeders, food that we put out and the birds that use them, to see how these things have changed over time. This is made up of a representative sample of gardens or garden owners from across the country in rural and suburban gardens, and it's an invite-only survey. Now, both these have been quite important tools in understanding what's happening. The kind of other thing I will mention is the Garden Wildlife Health Project, which is a collaborative project between us, ZSL, Froglife and RSPB, which aims to monitor the health of and identify disease threats to British garden wildlife. We do also have a number of other partners beyond those. But essentially, if you ever see sick or dead birds in your garden, such as this poor great tit, which probably has avian pox, please do report it so we can actually, that record can actually do something useful. So, supplementary feeding. Before I get to gardens, it's worth thinking about what supplementary feeding is, or what it does rather. Now, it is an important and effective conservation tool. The spread and reproduction of red kites is quite a good example of this. Whether that should still be happening is a different question. But the other things, we have things like the feeding of overwintering swans by WWT. Again, this has helped support their population, but also helps us monitor what is happening to them. And even when it comes to small birds, so for example, providing winter food as part of agriculture environmental schemes run by government does help support farmland granivores, so small finches and buntings, things like these linnets. So there is an important conservation tool, but also bird feeding is a human activity. It's something that we like doing. From feeding pigeons in Trafalgar Square, not that you're allowed to do that these days, for that matter, feeding them in your park, feeding the ducks in the park. But really, as given the topic of this symposium, it's about garden bird feeding, which is quite probably the most widespread and popular form of human-wildlife interaction throughout the world. In a UK context, we tend to estimate around 40 to 55% of households feed birds semi-regularly. Those estimates do come from a few years ago, so it'd be interesting to see if the cost of living crisis has changed that. But either way, we are providing a huge amount of food. in our gardens. So researchers at Reading a few years ago looked at the amount of calories that a typical garden owner is providing to their birds in their garden. And these are potentially running to tens of thousands of calories per month in some cases. And that is enough energy to support the needs of almost 200 million individual birds if we take the kind of average resource needs for the top 10 common UK garden birds. But the actual population of those birds is about 70 million. So we're actually providing far more resource than those birds need to survive. And so this is going to have effects on our wider habitat. But feeding birds isn't really anything new. So it's been considered a national pastime since the early 1900s, arguably beyond. And come the 1940s, 50s, there's already books and things out there and feeder designs about how we should supply food to birds in our gardens and elsewhere. But it's really come the 60s and 80s where we got the commercialization of bird feeding. There's more projects coming through, specifically designed for gardens. We also have the growth of things like membership magazines and more books in general about these things. And we can see over time that the number of projects has increased drastically. This is based on an analysis by colleagues of the RSPB's then called Birds magazine, essentially looking at the adverts in the issues. And over time, the number of adverts per issue has dramatically increased. And a lot of this relates to the introduction of new food types. And particularly important to feel is the introduction of black sunflower seeds, very high energy food. And then we have development of more feed mixes, particularly things like sunflower hearts. Another range, this range of food types has become available. But so we're putting out lots of food. It's a huge variety of food. So we're thinking about what it actually does. What happens when we feed the birds? I suspect most of us would like to feel that we are helping birds survive better. And that's very much our aim of many of us. But actually measuring this directly is quite challenging. We would mainly do this for small birds through bird ringing, and now we measure survival over time. But small birds don't tend to catch that long, don't get to live that long, they can be hard to catch. So getting decent estimates over time are quite difficult. We can, though, more directly infer it. So we can show, in some species at least, that providing food will improve their health over non-fed populations, just helping fight infections better, needing lower energy use overnight, particularly in the winter. And some researchers in Sweden have particularly looked at this, and they found that fed birds over winter maintained a better condition overnight, and say they fight infections better. So this implies that they will survive better. But we also got to think about what effect that has on productivity, on the breeding success of these birds. There's fairly good evidence that by feeding birds, we can allow them to breed earlier. This is generally considered advantageous for the most part, albeit there is the risk of the weather catching up for you if you breed too early in the spring. And the advance isn't huge, so we're talking 2 or 3 days on average from most studies. But this could be advantageous. Now, we might think and hope if we are providing food and adult birds are using it, even if they don't feed it to their chicks, then there will be an advantage to their productivity, their actual number of chicks they produce as well. And some studies have found this. For example, this study found that blue tits on average fledge 1 chick more. But other studies have found a negative effect. Some of this could be linked, for example, the nutrient we are providing may not be suitable for production of good eggs, for example. So these relationships are more complicated than you might expect on the surface. We have also changed our garden birds, and indeed some birds which we might not even traditionally consider a garden bird. This is the blackcap, a male blackcap, and they are a migratory species in the UK traditionally. done something weird to my British map. Interesting. That should be a Union Jack. So traditionally, these birds will breed here and winter, at least a breeding population will winter in southern Iberia, northern Africa, and elsewhere in Europe, say in Germany. These birds would winter in a similar location, perhaps a little further north. Now, there has always been some lost birds who have ended up here in the winter. And in general, these birds have likely not survived and or been forced to move south. However, in recent years, the numbers actually staying the winter has grown. And we have evidence based on our particular garden birdwatch data, but also from analysing the movements of blackcaps themselves, that garden bird feeding has probably driven this change. And it's not just, so we've changed their migration without meaning to, but it's not just the migration itself, we've also changed their morphology, their physical characteristics. And in particular, because these birds no longer have to migrate as far, their wings have become shorter and more rounded, because they just don't need to, whereas more migratory birds still have longer wings. There's also been changes in their beaks. For example, they've become narrower, which you think is an adaptation to help them use bird food more, things like fats and sunflower hearts potentially. And there's also subtle changes in their coloration as well. So we are driving evolution in the species in a relatively short period of time without meaning to. More generally, as a byproduct of all these aspects and more, we are influencing their bird distribution. I'll give the blackcap as an example of that as well. We're also changing the structure of our birds in and around our gardens, and indeed the wider countryside, and contributing to bird population growth. Goldfinches are quite a good example of these. Of course, traditionally they'd be considered a farmland bird. Indeed, they still are. But if we're looking at the garden birds feeding survey analysis that, say, colleagues did a few years ago, we found that their usage of feeders has dramatically increased since the 1970s to the present, well, to 2012, and indeed this trend has continued to some extent. And particularly in the last 2-3 decades, their population has risen dramatically, which again, we believe is linked to the feeding. Another example of this I'm going to pick out is the great spotted woodpecker. And again, they seem to have done very well in recent years, albeit they've stabilized much more quickly than goldfinches in their population growth. Now, of course, not all these birds are winners, although some of them may have very little to do with garden bird feeding. But a key problem in recent years has been the appearance and spread of disease. And that's because we're putting out concentration of food in our gardens. We're grouping large numbers of birds together in a natural way, both with the same species and other species. And particularly if we don't clean our feeders very well, and water sources and other factors, we've got a recipe for high rates of disease transmission. And one of the major examples, which many of you will have heard of in recent years, is the decline of greenfinches. Now, greenfinches are were a common garden bird. And indeed, we're doing very well until about 2006, 5-6, probably as a result of bird feeding. And then from then, around that time, we detected a disease, predecessors detected disease known as finch trichinosis. This is a variant of a disease that's quite common in things like pigeons. But this particular variety has driven, we believe, the decline of this species dramatically. And we're talking the order of 80% decline. And so that's several 100,000 birds potentially that we've lost due to this disease. Albeit more recently, some sign of stabilization. Now, it wasn't the only species affected. We've known from the start that chaffinch do catch this disease. However, they didn't decline until about 2013, 14. when suddenly they too started dropping off. And we suspect this was finch trichomanosis. Some work that I have lead on established that we are about as sure as we can by combining things like our breeding bird survey with garden wildlife health data to show that yes, this is probably finch trichomanosis. And we also identified that it appeared to be worse in human habitats. And by that I mean around where we live. And so i.e. our gardens. And one of the things around our gardens, or in our gardens rather, is supplementary food. So that suggests, it doesn't guarantee, but suggests that supplementary food has played a role in this occurring. And most and more of us led us to kind of do a greater assessment of the health hazards involved in feeding wild birds in our gardens. And the important part of this is establishing, well, doing the things like this, informing people of the risks, and also trying to tell if people follow our best practice advice, and indeed, does our best practice actually work? We have lots of ideas about cleaning feet, particularly things like around cleaning feeders. Does this actually work in the real world? And what actually happens in the gardens? Yes, we've pointed in gardens, we've pointed at garden bird feeding, but a lot of it is relatively circumstantial. So we've been working in the last year or so closely with ZSL and OSPB, our garden wildlife health partners, to try and establish what actually is happening in gardens. This work has a number of strands. To be honest, I expected to mostly focus my talk on this, but sadly it's not quite ready yet. Although I will highlight, as it may be raised, that on the back of this work, which again is not completed, OSPB have, under the precautionary principle, decided, or we've found that there's potential for flat surface feeding, so things like bird tables, and this sort of contraption, that this may represent a greater risk for disease transmission, or finch trichomanosis disease transmission. And so as precaution, they have withdrawn selling flat feeders. But this is a developing area, and so the advice may change, but it may also solidify. Now, the thing is, it's not just disease transmission that's potentially negative of bird feeding. Could we be, as Schutt and Lees in a paper published 3 years ago, say we are killing with kindness? Is providing all this food actually helping or hindering biodiversity conservation? So this is a schematic that they made. And the idea here is that we're providing lots of food, as I've already pointed out, an excess of food that should support our target bird species. And this will particularly be dominated by things like blue tits and great tits, who are very common and quite aggressive towards other species. Let's say but there's a wider network of connections going on, particularly going to focus on this area. So we're boosting these populations, yes, but also by running this food, we are also potentially boosting populations of other birds, or other creatures rather. So things like invasive parakeets and grey squirrels, and as well as our native species, albeit not necessarily the most popular species, things like magpies. So these resources aren't going where we aim them to go, as I pointed out, and indeed, the presence of things like grey squirrels dramatically decreases the availability of these food resources to garden birds, and while they benefit from it. And it gets even more interesting when we consider that this is work during my PhD at Reading, that we actually found that by providing bird food experimentally, that there was an increase in the risk of nest predation in the surrounding area. So even if these things like particularly magpies and jays, even if they don't use our bird feeders, we may well be pulling them in, and they will then forage around in the areas of particularly our gardens and predate native bird nests. Entirely natural process, but this may be counterproductive to what we want, potentially counterproductive to what we want to achieve, particularly for feeding birds in the breeding season. The other aspect we need to consider is that some of the species that we want to benefit may not benefit from feeding. So we have things like, in the case, the willow tit is a particularly strong example of this. Willow tit have been doing very poorly in recent years, although this decline predates the widespread adoption of garden bird feeding as we know it today. And it may be that by boosting our common competitive species, blue tits and great tits particularly, that we may well be adding to the decline we're seeing in the species. Now, this is relatively difficult to test directly. But we have found researchers at the University of Oxford, the EGI, Edward Gray Institute, have found that marsh tits tend to avoid feeders being frequented by larger numbers of the more aggressive blue tits and great tits. And this species is not doing quite as badly as willow tit, but it has declined significantly. And so it may be that, yeah, through feeding our common birds, we may actually be having a negative effect. Because it's not only the direct interaction between them. The simple fact is that it's not only it reaches beyond our gardens. By feeding these birds, we will then their populations, well, they may survive better as we think they do, and so there'll be more of them next year. So they'll be more likely to outcompete the birds, our target birds, of conservation concern, further. There's other impacts as well. There's the footprint of our food and any potential ethical considerations around that. So, for example, Niger seed, a favourite among goldfinches, albeit possibly less so these days. It originates from and is grown in Ethiopia as a cash crop. And quite apart from any potential considerations about what was happening in country, it still needs to be transported here. So there is a carbon footprint there we haven't really thought about. The same with things like sunflower seeds. Much of that going into the bird food chain particularly came from places like Ukraine, which is no longer happening due to circumstances there. So there is a wider impact around the world, and indeed one that recent research found that we didn't even think about. So fertilizers. So we mine particularly phosphorus. So there's potential that phosphorus spread on bird food crops is actually contributing to the environmental phosphate pollution here in this country. This doesn't necessarily just come from garden birds. This can also come from game bird feeding as well. But this is a form of pollution that we really hadn't thought about, that's spreading into our woodlands and from our gardens on a similar scale to that seen in garden bird artificial fertilizer usage, gardening fertilizer usage. So it's not necessarily a huge impact, but it is an impact that we hadn't thought about. And there's other factors we haven't really considered yet, such as the use of pesticides or on these crops. Because just because we are feeding the birds doesn't necessarily mean that that's been borne in mind with the producers. There is some work underway on this around this, I believe, but it is something we need to think about. So the last section has been quite negative on bird feeding. I think the key point we need to remember, aside from potential advantages to individual birds that we want to support, is the engagement side of things. Bird feeding, say, it's a massively popular topic, an activity, both from young and old, and it's an activity that we makes us happy. And by bringing them closer to us, we can see them better. That potentially increases our happiness further. We also have to consider, as conservation organisations, even if we went out tomorrow and recommended against bird feeding, would people actually pay attention to that? That is another aspect that we need to explore further, particularly if we potentially do develop our recommendations further. But hopefully you'll take away from this, there are both benefits and negative effects of bird feeding. They are complicated. There are trade-offs where that trade-offs, the point of that trade-off where it becomes worth it or not worth it, is potentially quite an individual decision. But we are researching this area actively, and say advice may change. If you are going to feed birds in your garden, please practice good feeder hygiene, also things like water baths. This may, for example, not only does it mean cleaning the bird feeders regularly, but also if you buy a bird feeder, making sure that it's one you can actually clean effectively. It's also worth taking a step back, and this kind of applies to some things that Richard mentioned, in considering kind of our planting and other things we can do in our gardens that aren't necessarily feeding that can help birds. A lot of what will help invertebrates will also help the birds that eat them and the plants that they pollinate. So there's a lot of work around here potentially to do. Again, much of the advice out there, it may well be effective, but a lot of it hasn't really been tested. So that's another area that may develop over time as well. And with that, I'm going to finish there. So thank you very much, especially to my colleagues, Kate Plummer and Gavin Soroordner and the Garden Birdwatch team, and our volunteers that gather most of our data and take part, and also the funders who fund us this various work. Thank you.